Templeback, Bristol, 24th November 1940, 20 minutes before 6 in the evening. Sub-Officer Walter Pardoe, a composite figure built from the documented pattern of Bristol Fire Brigade Dock Division crews in this period, not a named individual, 38 years old, 12 years in the Docks Division, had the Dennis Big Four running before the first wave of bombs had finished falling on the old city. The call had come the way calls came from this stretch of the harbour. A Port Authority watchman on Broad Quay, on the direct telephone line the dock company kept open to Templeback, reporting fire in the transit sheds and smoke already reaching toward the Avon tobacco warehouse. Pardoe had attended 3 fires in bonded warehouses on this reach of the Floating Harbour before the war. He knew what tightly packed tobacco hogsheads did once they caught. A slow, dense, acrid burn that built heat in a confined bay faster than the smoke outside ever suggested. He knew what the enclosed dock did to a fire that reached the water's edge. No tide to flush it, no current to carry heat away, just still water holding the warmth of whatever was burning beside it. That knowledge had been built the ordinary way, 3 attendances at 3 ordinary fires, in the 4 years before anyone in Bristol had reason to expect bombs. What Pardoe did not know, in the 90 seconds between the appliance leaving Templeback and the first sight of smoke over Broad Quay, was how many more fires were alight behind him in Redcliffe and the old city centre, or whether Templeback would still have a second appliance free to send after this one. What did 12 years of attending Floating Harbour bonded warehouse fires tell Sub-Officer Pardoe about the fire he was about to meet at Broad Quay? And what did the opening raid of the Bristol Blitz change about every assumption that peacetime experience had given him? The Dennis Big Four that Templeback sent to Broad Quay carried a turbine pump documented at up to 700 gallons a minute, a substantial delivery for a municipal brigade appliance of its era, built around a 4-cylinder overhead valve engine that Dennis Brothers of Guildford had been supplying to British brigades since the 1930s. Pardoe knew what 700 gallons a minute could do against a bonded warehouse fire that was still confined to one bay. Enough, with a line on the seat inside 4 or 5 minutes, to hold it there. What he also knew, from the 3 peacetime attendances, was that the figure meant nothing if the crew could not get the line to the seat, and inside a bonded warehouse packed floor to ceiling with tobacco hogsheads, getting to the seat was the whole of the problem. Bristol Fire Brigade's response to the Floating Harbour ran through Templeback, the central station positioned between the commercial heart of the city and the dock itself, close enough that a call from a Port Authority watchman reached an appliance within minutes under ordinary conditions. That was the system built for peacetime fires. 1 central station, 1 dock company keeping a direct line open, a watch system that kept a crew and an appliance ready around the clock. It was a system built to answer 1 fire at a time. 24 November 1940 was not 1 fire. Within the first hour of the raid, more than 70 fires had taken hold across the city, and by 8 o'clock that evening the water mains themselves had been struck, forcing the AFS to begin relaying water from the river and the harbour instead of the hydrant network the whole system had been built around. Templeback's peacetime dispatch arrangement, 1 station, 1 line, 1 appliance per call, had not been designed for a night when the water supply itself became a casualty before the fires were out. Before we continue, if this kind of documentation is what you have been looking for, consider subscribing. Every video on this channel goes into 1 specific element of the British Fire Brigade between 1900 and 1980. The appliance, the building, the knowledge that the officer had built from previous attendances, and the community that depended on that knowledge before smoke detectors and sprinklers changed what fire could do before the crew arrived. Not spectacle. The documented operational intelligence of a fire brigade that protected communities built from Victorian and Georgian building stock that burned in specific ways that specific people had learned to read. What did 12 years of attending Floating Harbour bonded warehouse fires give Sub-Officer Pardoe that the Dennis Big Four's pump rating and the AFS training manual had not provided? And what happened to that knowledge when Bristol's commercial docks closed for good in 1975? And if you or your family served with Bristol Fire Brigade or the Auxiliary Fire Service during the Blitz, or worked the Floating Harbour docks in this period, put it in the comments. What do you remember? or what were you told? The next video in this series follows what the National Fire Service did to the divisional knowledge that Templeback's pre-war crews had spent a decade building. Back at Broad Quay, what the appliance system could deliver: one 700-gallon-a-minute pump, one direct dock company line, one central station, had been sufficient for the fires Pardoe had known before the war. What the night of 24th November demanded was every part of that system operating at once, against more fires than it had crews to answer, with the water supply it depended on already failing. Before you can understand why a bonded tobacco warehouse on the Floating Harbour was a different problem from a transit shed beside it, you need to understand what a bonded warehouse was built to do. Bond warehouses like A-Bond, the building Pardoe's smoke column was tracking toward, existed to hold imported cargo, tobacco, wine, spirits, under customs seal before duty was paid on it. That meant they were built dense, old brick walls, timber floors, high-value cargo, packed tightly to use every available foot of storage the customs authority would license. It was construction designed around cargo security and space efficiency, not around fire compartmentation. A fire that reached the interior of a fully stocked bond warehouse did not meet open floor space and fire breaks. It met a solid mass of flammable cargo stacked from wall to wall. Pardoe's 3 peacetime attendances had taught him what that meant operationally. A fire in a bond warehouse did not behave like a fire in an open transit shed, where flame and smoke had room to move and a line could often be got around the seat from more than one side. In a packed bond warehouse, the fire found its own path through the stacked cargo, and the crew found theirs by following where the smoke was thickest and the heat radiating from the stacks was most intense, reading the building's interior through what came off it, because there was rarely a clear line of sight to the seat itself. The specific risk Pardoe had learned to watch for in tobacco stock was the way a slow smoulder deep in a stack could hold heat for far longer than the visible smoke outside suggested, then take hold rapidly once air reached it, through a broken window, a collapsed section of roof, or simply the draft created by opening the wrong door first. 3 attendances had taught him the order to open things in. That order was the specific value of the knowledge, and it was not written in the AFS training manual, because the training manual could not know which door at A-Bond opened onto which stack. What did the construction of a bonded warehouse, built for customs security rather than fire safety, tell an experienced Bristol firefighter about how a fire inside it would behave differently from a fire in the transit shed next to it, and what had 3 ordinary peacetime attendances given Pardoe that no manual could have supplied? What made the Floating Harbour different from the docks Pardoe might have trained alongside in Liverpool or London was written into the water itself. Bristol's harbour was not a tidal dock. It had been engineered, in the early 19th century, into a permanently enclosed, non-tidal basin held at constant level, the reason it was called the Floating Harbour rather than simply the docks. That engineering solved a genuine commercial problem. Ships could load and unload at any state of the tide without grounding. It also meant that a fire reaching the harbour's edge met still water with no tidal flushing to carry heat, oil, or burning debris away from the quaysides packed with warehouses. Unlike Liverpool's or London's dock systems, where warehouses and city fabric were often separated by a distinct dock boundary, Bristol's port sat directly inside the city. The Floating Harbour ran through the commercial heart of Bristol, with warehouses, transit sheds, and the medieval and Georgian street pattern of the old city built hard against its edges. A dock fire on Broad Quay was not a fire at a remove from the city that could be contained within the port boundary. It was, immediately, an urban fire, one that could move from a warehouse roof to the terraced streets and commercial buildings behind it within the same attendance. That geography was the reason Pardoe's assessment at Broad Quay had to run 2 directions at once: what the bonded warehouse fire was doing to itself and what it could do to the streets of the old city rising immediately behind the dock wall. A fire brigade answering a Floating Harbour warehouse fire was, in the same call, answering a potential city centre fire. And on the night of 24th November 1940, with more than 70 fires already alight elsewhere in Bristol, that dual assessment had to be made with no certainty that a second appliance existed to answer whichever direction the fire chose. What did the floating harbour's enclosed, non-tidal engineering, built to solve a shipping problem, not a fire problem, mean for how close a dock fire's risk sat to the heart of the city? And what did that proximity demand of an officer assessing a warehouse fire at Broad Quay in November 1940? By 8 o'clock on the night of 24 November, the water mains across Bristol had been struck by the raid, and the AFS response documented for that night records crews relaying water from the river and the harbour in place of the hydrant network the whole system had been built to use. For a crew working a floating harbour warehouse fire, that failure changed almost nothing about the immediate tactical picture. The harbour itself was already the nearest static water supply, and Pardo's peacetime attendances had already taught him to draw suction from the dock when a hydrant run was too long. For crews fighting fires away from the water, in the terraced streets and commercial premises of the old city with no dock beside them, the failure of the mains meant relay lines stretched back across a damaged road network toward whatever static water could be found: canal, river, static tank, or harbour. The blackout made every part of this more difficult before a single hose was run. Street lighting across the city had been extinguished as a matter of policy since the outbreak of war, which meant that appliances moved through Bristol's damaged streets at night with headlamps dimmed to blackout regulation, drivers relying on local knowledge of the route rather than visible signage or lit junctions. For a Templeback crew working their own division, that local knowledge was itself a form of the same expertise Pardo carried about the warehouses. Years of driving the same streets meant knowing which corner was too narrow for the appliance's turning circle before the driver could see it in the dark. Mutual aid reached Bristol from brigades in the surrounding counties during the heaviest raids, a documented pattern consistent with the wider AFS mutual aid arrangements organised across the southwest in this period. Appliances and crews from Somerset and Gloucestershire brought into a city whose complex dock geography and medieval street pattern they had never worked. A crew from outside the division could bring a pump and a full complement of firefighters. It could not bring 12 years of knowing which door at Obond opened onto which stack, or which corner near Broad Quay a wartime Dennis could not turn without reversing twice. What did the combination of a failed water main, a blacked-out street network, and mutual aid crews unfamiliar with Bristol's dock geography add to the operational problem that Pardo's building knowledge alone had been sufficient to answer in peacetime? And what did local knowledge become worth on a night when every other part of the system was under strain at once? Before the alarm reached Templeback, it reached a Port Authority watchman standing his post on Broad Quay through an air raid, because dock premises like this kept watchmen on through the war, precisely because the cargo behind those bond warehouse walls represented a substantial part of Bristol's wartime import trade. It was the watchman, not the fire brigade, who made the first assessment of the fire, smoke reaching toward a bond rather than staying contained in the transit shed, and it was the watchman's judgment, relayed down the dock company's direct line, that shaped how urgently Templeback treated the call. For the community around the floating harbour, a warehouse fire on the docks was never only the docks' problem. The bonded warehouses held cargo, tobacco, wine, spirits, imported through a port that connected Bristol to transatlantic trade of genuine national importance, and the dock workers, whose livelihoods depended on that trade, understood, in a way that needed no explanation, what a fire that reached the full stock of a bond warehouse could cost. A night watchman standing his post through a bombing raid to protect that cargo and to call the fire brigade the moment smoke appeared was doing exactly the job the dock company had built into its wartime arrangements. One direct telephone line, kept open specifically so that this assessment could happen without delay. Behind the dock wall, in the terraced streets and commercial premises of the old city, residents experienced the same raid without the watchman's professional vantage point. What they had was the sound of bombs continuing to fall elsewhere in the city, the dread of a raid that had already produced, within the hour, more than 70 fires they could not see but could sometimes glimpse the glow of, and the particular fear of a population living directly against a working dock, that a fire on the quay a few streets away could, given the right wind and the wrong luck, reach the terrace they were sheltering in. What did the Port Authority watchman's presence on Broad Quay through an air raid, and the direct line kept open specifically for his call, tell the community around the Floating Harbour about how seriously the risk to the bond warehouses was taken before a single bomb had fallen that night? And what did the residents of the old city understand about their own proximity to that risk that the watchman, in his professional post, was paid to assess? The raid of 24 November was not the only one Bristol absorbed that winter. A raid on the 2nd December 1940 was documented as targeting the harbour and industrial installations directly. And the 12-hour raid of 3 to 4 January 1941, the longest single raid Bristol endured, during which the largest bomb dropped on the city that winter failed to explode and was not recovered until 1943, showed that the pattern established on 24 November was not an isolated event, but a repeated operational reality that Templeback's crews had to answer through the whole of that winter. What each morning after a raid gave the crews and the community was the same specific reckoning. What had survived, what had not, and what the damage meant for the people whose work or whose home had depended on the building now gone. For dock workers, that reckoning was economic, in a way that was immediate and specific. A bond warehouse gutted overnight was cargo that would never clear customs, wages that would not be paid on stock that no longer existed, a link in Bristol's transatlantic trade broken for as long as it took to rebuild. 26 Bristol Fire Brigade personnel are named on the Avon Fire and Rescue Service Roll of Honour, among 47 fire service personnel from the wider area who did not survive the war, a documented cost that sat behind every morning after assessment Templeback's surviving crews made. For the old city itself, the accumulated mornings across that winter of raids meant watching, street by street, which parts of medieval and Georgian Bristol were still standing, and which had gone the way of the almshouses on Temple Street and North Street, St. Nicholas Church, and the 16th century Dutch house, buildings whose loss was recorded not because any one of them was more valuable than the warehouses on the docks, but because their destruction made visible, in daylight, what the fires of the night before had actually cost a city that held centuries of its own history in buildings that had never been built to survive incendiary war. What did the repeated pattern of major raids across the winter of 1940 to 41, 24 November, 2nd December, 3 to 4 January, tell Bristol Fire Brigade about the operational reality it was now answering? And what did the accumulated mornings after teach the crews of Templeback that no single raid, however severe, could have taught on its own? Before you can understand what changed for Bristol Fire Brigade after the winter of 1940-41, you need to understand what the National Fire Service was formed to solve. In August 1941, the many separate local brigades across Britain, Bristol's among them, each with its own appliances, its own watch system, its own dispatch arrangements built around a single central station at Templeback, were unified into a single national fire service under central command. The change was a direct response to exactly the kind of night Pardoe had worked on 24 November. Separate brigades with incompatible equipment and no shared command structure, forced to coordinate mutual aid across county boundaries in the middle of a raid, when every minute spent establishing who was in charge was a minute not spent on the fire. What the NFS gave Bristol operationally was standardization. Compatible hose couplings and pump fittings across brigades, a formal structure for organizing mutual aid before it was needed rather than improvising it during a raid, and a documented chain of command that meant a Somerset crew arriving at Broad Quay had a clearer idea, on paper, of who to report to than Pardoe's mutual aid crews had the previous November. It did not, and could not, standardize the specific knowledge of which door at a bond opened onto which stack. That knowledge remained where it had always lived, in the officers and crews who had worked the same buildings for years, regardless of what uniform or command structure sat above them. The National Fire Service preserved what it could document and standardize. What it inherited without being able to formalize was the Blitz's operational learning at the level Pardoe had experienced it. The specific, hard-won knowledge of how a particular building in a particular division burned, built through repeated attendance and paid for, in November and December 1940 and January 1941, in fires that did not stop for a training school to catch up with what they were teaching. What did the National Fire Service's standardization of equipment and command structure in 1941 change about how Bristol's Fire Brigade operated? And what, in the specific building knowledge that men like Pardoe carried, could a national reorganization never actually standardize? The Floating Harbour's commercial role did not end with the war. Avonmouth and Portishead, the larger docks built on the Severn estuary from the 1870s onward, had already been drawing the biggest ships away from the old city centre harbour for decades, and that shift continued through the post-war period as Bristol rebuilt. The Floating Harbour remained a working dock into the 1960s and early 1970s, but its commercial shipping traffic finally closed altogether in 1975. The point at which the specific fire risk Pardoe had spent his career learning to read, a fully stocked bond warehouse on a still water dock, embedded in the heart of the city, stopped being a live operational problem for Bristol's crews, and became, instead, a historical one. The post-war building regulations that followed reorganization across British fire brigades, improved road access engineered into the rebuilt dock area, fire-resistant construction standards applied to new commercial premises, and eventually the local government reorganization of 1974 that folded Bristol Fire Brigade into the newly formed Avon Fire Brigade, integrating the city with the surrounding county areas it had once relied on for wartime mutual aid, changed the operational environment permanently. A new commercial building on a redeveloped Floating Harbour waterfront in 1976 was not built to hold tobacco hogsheads under customs seal. It did not present the same problem, and it did not need an officer who had spent a decade learning which door opened onto which stack. If this channel is going to keep documenting what British firefighters knew about the buildings they entered and what that knowledge cost to acquire, subscribe. There are more appliances, more divisions, more watch systems, more relay lines run by torchlight from a still harbour at 2 in the morning, and more building knowledge learned the hard way during a winter of repeated raids that was never written down anywhere and that kept Bristol's old city standing through 1940 and 1941. What did 12 years of attending Floating Harbour bonded warehouse fires give Sub-Officer Pardoe that the Dennis Big Four's pump rating and the AFS training manual had not provided? And what happened to that knowledge when Bristol's commercial docks closed for good in 1975? And if you have an incident, a station, a watch, a building, put it in the comments. If you or your family served with Bristol Fire Brigade or the Auxiliary Fire Service during the Blitz, or worked the Floating Harbour docks in this period, what do you remember, or what were you told? The next video in this series follows what the National Fire Service did to the divisional knowledge that Templeback's pre-war crews had spent a decade building. The Floating Harbour closed to commercial shipping in 1975. 26 Bristol Fire Brigade personnel who did not survive the war they were called to fight are named on the Avon Fire and Rescue Service Roll of Honour. What the post-war rebuilding gave Bristol: better road access to the dock, fire-resistant construction standards, a unified county fire service integrating Bristol with the counties that had sent mutual aid crews through Blitz black streets they had never learned. What it removed: the bonded tobacco and wine warehouses that had taught a generation of Templeback officers how cotton and tobacco stock burned when a fire found its way into a fully stacked bay, and the specific order of doors to open that 3 peacetime attendances and a winter of wartime ones had taught men like Pardoe and never asked them to write down. The new buildings did not produce the fires that had built that knowledge. They did not need to. That was the point. The knowledge went where knowledge, like it always went, with the officers who had carried it, into retirement, into the next posting, into the parts of a career that no training manual had ever been asked to record. Nobody had asked the water, or the warehouses, or the men who had read both, to leave anything behind. They left it anyway, the way a still harbour holds no record of what it once reflected.